He owned more land than any man within 50 miles. Yet the night he opened his door, he realized he had nowhere to belong. The rain came down in long silver lines, tapping against the roof of Caleb Whitaker's ranch house like it had something to say, but he hadn't listened to anything in years. Out here in West Texas, 30 miles from the nearest town, a man could disappear without leaving, and Caleb had done just that. His boots rested by the fire, his hat hung untouched on the nail by the door, and the only sound inside was the steady crackle of burning mesquite. Then came the knock. Not loud, not desperate, just there. He didn't move at first. Men didn't come this far unless they wanted something, and Caleb had learned the hard way that opening doors cost more than keeping them shut. The knock came again, softer this time, almost swallowed by the wind. He stood, slow, like a man remembering how, and crossed the wooden floor, each step echoing louder than it should. When he opened the door, the storm pushed in with it, cold and sharp, and standing there were two children. A boy, maybe 10, holding his ground like it was the only thing he had left. A girl, smaller, clutching a thin cord around her neck, her eyes too still for someone her age. Their clothes were soaked through, mud up to their ankles, and neither of them spoke. Not a word. They just looked at him. Caleb's hand stayed on the door, half ready to close it again. He'd seen that look before. Not fear. Not exactly. It was something quieter. Something that didn't expect kindness, but didn't stop hoping for it either. The wind howled across the open land, rattling the fence posts out by the pasture, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled low and slow. "You lost?" Caleb asked, his voice rough from disuse. The boy shook his head once. The girl didn't move at all. For a long moment, none of them said anything. The kind of silence that stretches until it breaks or becomes something else. Caleb glanced past them, out into the dark, where the road disappeared into nothing. No wagon, no horses, no lanterns, just rain, just night, just two children standing where they shouldn't be. He exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound, almost a surrender. "Storm will take you if you stay out there," he muttered, stepping aside just enough. The boy hesitated, then stepped in first, guiding the girl with a hand that tried too hard to be steady. Water dripped from their clothes onto the floorboards as they crossed the threshold, and Caleb shut the door behind them, sealing out the storm, but not whatever had followed them here. He could feel it in the air, the way the room shifted, the way the fire seemed smaller than before. The girl's fingers tightened around that cord at her neck, and Caleb noticed it then, a small, worn piece hanging from it, tucked just beneath her collar. Something old, something important, something that didn't belong to a child wandering alone in the rain. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb Whitaker felt it. That quiet pull in his chest, the kind a man only gets when trouble isn't coming. It's already arrived. The fire snapped a little louder as the children stepped closer, the warmth reaching them in slow waves, but neither of them relaxed. Not really. Not the way most folks did when they found shelter after a storm, and Caleb noticed that right away. The way the boy kept his shoulders tight and his eyes moving, counting doors, windows, corners, like he had learned not to trust a room just because it had walls, and the girl stayed near him, always half a step behind, her fingers still wrapped around that thin cord at her neck like it was the only thing anchoring her to this place. And Caleb turned back to the hearth without saying much, grabbing an old wool blanket from the back of a chair and tossing it toward them. Not gentle, not rough either, just enough. And the boy caught it before it hit the floor, draping it around the girl first without thinking, like it had always been his job, and Caleb watched that small motion, the kind that said more than words ever could. Then he reached for a cast iron pot hanging near the fire, pouring what was left of the stew into two chipped bowls, the smell of beans and salt pork filling the room, simple food, but real, and he set them down on the table, nodding once. "Eat," he said, voice low, and they did, fast at first, then slower when they realized no one was taking it away, and still, they said nothing, not their names, not where they came from, not why they were out in a storm miles from anywhere, and Caleb did not press, not yet, because he had learned that answers given too early were usually the wrong ones. Instead, he leaned back against the wall, arms folded, watching the rain trace lines down the window glass, and for a moment, the house almost felt like it used to, before silence had settled into it like dust, before every chair had become too large for one man, But the feeling did not last, because then the boy spoke. Just one sentence, quiet but steady. "We will leave at first light." And Caleb turned his head slightly, studying him. The way the words came out, not as a question, not even a request, just a plan already made. And something in that tightened the air again. "Storm might not be done by then," Caleb replied, and the boy shrugged, a small movement, like weather did not matter much anymore, and the girl finally shifted, just enough for the firelight to catch the object hanging at her neck. And Caleb saw it clearer now, a small metal piece, worn smooth at the edges, not decoration, not exactly, something else, something that had weight beyond what it looked like. And without thinking, he asked, "What is that you are holding?" And the girl's hand tightened instantly, pulling it closer, her eyes lifting to meet his for the first time, sharp, guarded. And she did not answer, not even a word. And the boy's gaze followed, steady as a line drawn in dust. And Caleb raised one hand slightly, not pushing, just acknowledging. "All right," he said, almost to himself, turning back to the fire. But outside, beyond the walls, beyond the reach of the lantern light, something shifted in the night, something distant but real, the faint echo of hooves pressing into wet earth, too far to see, too quiet to name, but close enough that Caleb Whitaker felt it settle deep in his bones. And he knew, without needing proof, that whatever had brought those children to his door had not stopped at the gate. The night stretched long after the bowls were emptied, the fire settling into a low, steady glow that painted the walls in slow-moving shadows. And Caleb did not sleep, not even when the children finally did. The girl curled beneath the blanket with one hand still wrapped around that small metal piece, the boy sitting upright for longer than any child should, eyes open, listening, until exhaustion pulled him under in silence. And Caleb stayed where he was, near the window, watching the dark beyond the glass, because he knew that sound, faint as it was, the distant rhythm carried through wet earth, and it did not belong to the storm. Hours passed like that, measured only by the shifting light of the fire and the slow easing of rain against the roof, until the first gray hint of dawn touched the horizon, thin and cold. And Caleb stepped outside before either child woke, the air sharp, the ground heavy with mud, and he walked past the fence line, boots sinking an inch with every step, until he found them. Tracks, fresh, not washed away by rain, not scattered, but deliberate, 6 sets at least, maybe more, circling wide around the property like someone taking measure rather than rushing in. And Caleb crouched low, brushing a hand over the imprint, feeling the weight of it, the intent behind it. Then he stood, slow, eyes scanning the distance where the land rolled flat for miles, empty to anyone who did not know how to read it. But he did, he always had. And this was not wandering. This was searching. He turned back toward the house, the quiet inside now feeling different, smaller somehow, as if the walls had closed in overnight. And when he stepped through the door, the boy was already awake, standing near the table, alert, like he had not slept at all. And the girl stood beside him, the blanket slipping from her shoulders, her eyes moving straight to Caleb's face, reading it before he spoke. They came close, Caleb said, not raising his voice, not needing to. And the boy nodded once, as if that confirmed something he had already known. "We told you," he replied, calm, too calm for someone his age. And Caleb looked at them both, really looked this time, at the way they held themselves, the quiet discipline in their stillness, the absence of fear in the usual places, replaced by something steadier, something learned. "Who are they?" Caleb asked, and the boy hesitated, just for a second, the first crack in that steady front. Then he glanced at the girl, and she shook her head slightly, almost invisible, but enough, and the answer never came. Instead, the boy said, "We will leave now," stepping toward the door as if the decision had already been made, as if staying was never part of the plan. And Caleb moved without thinking, one step, then another, placing himself between them and the door, not forceful, just present. "No," he said, quiet, firm, the word hanging in the air longer than it should. And the boy's eyes sharpened, measuring him now, weighing something unseen. "You do not understand," the boy replied, and Caleb gave a small nod, almost a concession. "You are right," he said. "I do not." His gaze shifted to the girl, to the small object resting against her chest, catching the first light of morning. But I know this much, he continued, voice low, steady as the land outside. Whatever they are looking for, they already found the trail. The room fell silent again, but this time it was different, heavier, and outside, far beyond the fence, the faint sound returned, distant but certain, not hurried, not loud, just patient, like something that knew exactly where to go next. Caleb did not move from the doorway, not when the boy stepped forward, not when the girl tightened her grip on that small metal piece. And for a moment the three of them stood there in a quiet standoff that had nothing to do with force and everything to do with choice, the kind a man only gets once or twice in a lifetime. And outside the sky was beginning to lighten, a pale gray stretching across the horizon, revealing more of the land with every passing second, and Caleb knew that once the sun rose fully there would be no more hiding, no more guessing, just open ground and clear lines of sight. You think leaving will keep them from finding you, Caleb said, his voice calm, measured, like he was speaking to himself as much as to them. But tracks do not vanish just because you want them to. The boy stopped a few feet from him, jaw set, and for the first time there was something close to frustration in his eyes, not fear, but the weight of running too long without rest. Staying puts you in danger. The boy replied, each word careful, like he had practiced saying it. This is not your fight. Caleb let out a quiet breath, the corners of his mouth barely shifting. Out here, he said, glancing toward the window where the light grew stronger. Anything that reaches your door becomes your fight whether you want it or not. The girl shifted then, stepping slightly to the side, her gaze moving between them, and for a second her hand loosened from the cord, just enough for the metal piece to slip free into the light, and Caleb saw it clearly for the first time, not just a piece of metal, but something shaped with purpose, engraved, worn from years of being held, not hidden, and something about it stirred a memory he could not quite place, something tied to land, to ownership, to promises made long before this moment. Where did you get that? He asked, softer now, and the girl hesitated, her eyes narrowing just a fraction. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper but steady. It belongs to my family. The words hung in the air, simple, but heavy with meaning, and the boy looked at her, surprised she had said anything at all, then back to Caleb, measuring again, deciding what to reveal and what to keep buried, and outside the distant sound came again, clearer, now in the stillness of morning, hooves pressing into damp ground, not rushing, not hiding, just coming, and Caleb turned his head slightly, listening, counting without looking. Then he stepped away from the door, not as a surrender, but as a shift, moving toward the far wall where his coat hung, reaching for it with slow, deliberate motion. If they are coming, Caleb said, pulling the coat over his shoulders, then we do not meet them in the open. The boy frowned, confusion flickering across his face. We are not staying, he insisted, but Caleb shook his head once, firm, final. You already stayed the moment you stepped inside, he replied, and something in his tone, quiet as it was, left no room for argument, the kind of certainty that did not come from pride, but from knowing exactly how these things ended when left alone. And the girl looked up at him again, really looked this time, as if trying to understand why a man who had everything would choose to step into something that was not his. And Caleb did not explain. He simply moved to the window, eyes fixed on the distant line where land met sky. And in that thin strip of rising light, shapes began to form, small at first, then clearer with every passing second. Riders, exactly as he had expected, not many, but enough, moving steady, unhurried, like men who knew they were close. And behind him, the room fell quiet again. But this time it was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence before something changed, and Caleb Whitaker stood there, not reaching for a weapon, not calling for help, just watching the horizon as it came closer to his door. The riders did not rush, and that was what made it worse. The way they moved across the open land like they had all the time in the world, like distance meant nothing when the end was already certain. And Caleb watched them grow from shapes into men, coats dark from the rain, hats low, their horses steady beneath them, 6 in total, just as the tracks had promised, not scattered, not careless, but aligned in a loose formation that spoke of purpose rather than chance. And behind him, the boy took a slow step forward, stopping just short of the window. His voice quieter now, almost resigned. "They always come like that," he said, and Caleb did not look back. "Like they have already decided how it ends," the boy added, and for a brief moment, Caleb's gaze shifted slightly, not away from the riders, but inward, as if measuring something older than this morning, something buried deeper than the land itself. "Most men decide too early," Caleb replied, his tone flat, but not empty, and the girl moved then, stepping closer to the table, her fingers brushing the edge of the wood as if grounding herself, and slowly, carefully, she lifted the small metal piece from her neck, not removing it fully, just enough to hold it in her palm, and the firelight caught it. Again, revealing more detail this time. Faint lines etched into its surface, marks worn but still there, and Caleb saw it clearly now, not just what it was, but what it meant. A claim, a marker, something tied to land and ownership, the kind of thing men built fortunes around or lost everything trying to protect. And his jaw tightened just slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. "That is not just something you wear," Caleb said quietly, and the girl shook her head once, her eyes steady on his. "No," she answered, "it is something they want." And outside, the riders slowed as they reached the outer fence, not crossing yet, just pausing, their silhouettes sharp against the pale morning sky, one of them leaning forward slightly in the saddle, studying the house, measuring distance, calculating without speaking, and Caleb stepped away from the window at last, turning toward the door, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as if time had shifted to match his pace. "Stay inside," he said, not loud, but firm enough that it settled into the room like a rule, and the boy's expression hardened, ready to argue. But something in Caleb's posture stopped him, the kind of stillness that did not invite questions, and the girl lowered her hand slowly, the metal piece resting against her chest once more, her fingers still wrapped around it, and Caleb reached for the door handle, pausing just a fraction of a second before opening it, the morning air cutting through the warmth behind him, cool and clean after the storm. And he stepped out onto the porch, closing the door softly at his back, not locking it, not needing to, because whatever was coming was already here, and the riders noticed him immediately, their attention shifting as one, not surprised, just acknowledging. And Caleb stood there, boots planted on weathered wood, coat hanging loose at his sides, no weapon drawn, no threat offered, just a man standing in his own space. And for a moment, nothing moved, the land, holding its breath between them, until one rider nudged his horse forward a few steps, stopping well short of the fence, his voice carrying easily across the distance, calm, controlled. "Morning," he called out, as if this were any other visit, any other ranch, and Caleb gave a small nod, just enough to answer. "Morning," he replied, and the rider tilted his head slightly, eyes flicking once toward the house behind Caleb, then back. "We are looking for something," he said, not asking, not demanding, just stating, and Caleb's gaze did not follow, did not shift. "Everything worth finding is already claimed," he answered, his voice steady as the ground beneath him, and the rider smiled faintly, not amused, but interested, as if the conversation had just begun, and the distance between them, measured in yards and silence, suddenly felt much smaller than it had a moment before. The rider did not move any closer, and that was the first thing Caleb noticed, the way the man held his distance like it was part of the conversation, not a barrier, not a threat, just a line drawn in the dirt that neither side had crossed yet, and the others behind him spread slightly, not circling, not pressing forward, just enough to watch everything at once. The house, the land, Caleb himself. And Caleb shifted his weight just enough to settle deeper into the porch boards beneath his boots, grounding himself in something solid, something that did not change with men or weather. "That's so," Caleb said, his voice even, and the rider gave a small nod, slow, deliberate, like he had all morning to finish what he came for. "Something small," the rider replied, "but valuable to the wrong people." His eyes flicked again toward the house, not lingering, just marking it, and Caleb followed that glance this time, just once, then back. "Wrong people usually do not ride this far for something small," he said, and there was a faint shift in the air, not tension exactly, but recognition, like both men understood more than they were saying, and the rider's mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile, more like an acknowledgement. "You are right about that," he answered, then leaned forward a fraction in the saddle, lowering his voice just enough that it carried weight instead of volume. "Two children came through here last night," he continued, caught in the storm, and Caleb did not answer right away, letting the words sit between them, because silence had a way of revealing more than questions ever could, and behind him, through the thin wood of the door, he could almost feel the stillness inside, the children waiting, listening, holding their breath without meaning to, and Caleb kept his eyes on the rider. "Storm brought a lot of things through," Caleb said at last, and the rider tilted his head, studying him more closely now, measuring not just the words, but the space between them. "It did," the rider agreed, "but not all of them belong where they land." And there it was, the first real edge in the conversation, not sharp, not loud, but present, and Caleb felt it settle into place, the moment where things stopped being polite and started being decided, and he took a slow breath, letting it out through his nose. "Everything on this land belongs where it stands," he said, and the rider's expression did not change. But something in his posture did, a slight straightening, a shift of weight, like a man adjusting to a different kind of conversation, and behind him, one of the other riders moved his horse half a step, nothing more, but enough to show they were listening too, all of them, and Caleb noticed that, the way they moved together without speaking, the way they did not rush him, did not push, just waited, confident in something unseen, and the lead rider glanced once more at the house, then back to Caleb. "We are not here to take anything that is not given," he said, his tone steady, almost reasonable, "but what we are looking for does not belong to those children." And Caleb's eyes narrowed just slightly, not in anger, but in focus, because that was new, not a demand, not a threat, but a claim, and claims could be tested. "Funny thing about belonging," Caleb said quietly. "Most men decide that after they already have it," and the rider's gaze held his, unblinking. And for a moment the world seemed to narrow to that single line between them, porch to fence, man to man, until the rider finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath. "Then maybe it is time we let them decide," he said, and Caleb did not move, did not step aside, but something inside him shifted, not doubt, not fear, something older, something he had not felt in a long time, the weight of standing for something that was not his, and behind him, inside that quiet house, two small lives waited on whatever he chose next, and Caleb Whitaker realized that this was no longer about land, or money, or even the past. It was about whether a man could choose to be different from what the world expected of him, even when it cost him everything he had built. Caleb did not answer right away, and that silence stretched long enough for the wind to shift across the open land, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and something older, something that had nothing to do with storms, and the rider watched him closely, not impatient, not pressing, just waiting the way men do when they believe time is already on their side. And behind Caleb, the house stood quiet, but not empty, not anymore, and he could feel it, the presence of those two children just beyond the door, their future hanging on words that had not yet been spoken. And Caleb finally took one slow step forward, not toward the rider, but away from the door, placing himself fully between the house and the men outside. A small movement, but one that settled things in a way no argument could. "They are children," Caleb said, his voice low, steady, carrying across the distance without effort, and the rider inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth without agreeing to anything more. "That does not change what they carry," he replied, and Caleb's gaze hardened just a fraction, not in anger, but in clarity. "It changes what should be done about it," he said, and for the first time, the rider's expression shifted, not much, just enough to show that the line had moved, not back, not forward, but deeper, and one of the men behind him adjusted in the saddle, a subtle shift, but enough to draw Caleb's attention for a heartbeat, long enough to understand that this was not just one man speaking. This was a group with a shared purpose, a shared belief, and that made things heavier, not lighter. "You are standing in the way of something that was decided long before this morning," the rider said, his tone still calm, but carrying a weight that suggested history, agreements, things signed or spoken in rooms far from this place. And Caleb let out a quiet breath, his eyes drifting once across the land, the fences, the open stretch that had been his for years, then back to the rider. A lot of things get decided far away from where they matter, Caleb answered. Does not mean they are right when they get here. And the rider studied him again, longer this time, as if trying to place him somewhere, not just as a rancher, but as something else, something that did not quite fit the picture. You are not like the others out here, the rider said, almost as a statement, and Caleb gave the smallest shake of his head. No, he replied. I am just a man who opens his door when it knocks. And the words hung there, simple, but heavier than anything said before, and behind that door, inside the quiet of the house, the girl stepped closer to it, her hand resting lightly against the wood, as if she could feel the weight of that moment through it, and the boy stood just behind her, watching, waiting, understanding more than he let on, and outside, the rider exhaled slowly, his gaze lifting briefly to the sky, now fully lit by morning, then back to Caleb. Then let us make this simple, he said, his voice calm, but final in a way that left little room for misinterpretation. Bring them out, let them choose, and we walk away with what is ours. And Caleb did not turn, did not look back at the door, but his eyes shifted just slightly, enough to show that he heard every word behind him, every breath, every movement, and for a moment, the world narrowed again to that single space between decision and consequence. And Caleb Whitaker stood there, feeling the weight of land, of years, of silence broken by two small figures in the rain. And he understood something then, something that had nothing to do with wealth or ownership, that a man could spend a lifetime building walls, only to find out that the one thing that mattered was whether he was willing to stand in front of them when it counted. Caleb did not turn toward the door, not when the rider made his offer, not when the weight of it settled into the boards beneath his boots, because he already knew that once that door opened, things would not return to what they were before, and behind him, inside that quiet house, the girl's hand remained pressed against the wood, feeling the faint vibration of voices carried through it, while the boy stood still, his eyes fixed not on the door, but on the space beside it, as if measuring the distance between staying hidden and stepping forward. And the fire inside had burned lower now, its glow softer, casting long shadows that stretched across the floor like silent witnesses to a choice neither of them had expected to make. And the girl slowly lowered her hand from the door, her fingers tightening again around the small metal piece, and she turned to the boy, her expression calm but certain, the kind of calm that comes not from safety, but from understanding what cannot be avoided. And the boy shook his head slightly, a quiet refusal, but it did not carry force, only worry. Only the weight of someone who had been deciding for both of them for too long. And outside, Caleb finally spoke, his voice steady. You want them to choose, he said, not asking, not agreeing, just placing the words where they belonged, and the rider nodded once. That is all, he replied, and Caleb's gaze shifted briefly to the horizon, the land stretching out in every direction, wide and open, offering nowhere to hide and nowhere to run. Then back to the rider. Choice only matters when it is real, Caleb said, not when it is cornered. And the rider's expression remained composed, but there was a flicker there, something that acknowledged the truth without surrendering to it. Then give them that, the rider answered, and the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but waiting, like the moment before a storm breaks. And inside, the girl took a step toward the center of the room, her movements slow, deliberate, and the boy followed, not leading this time, but staying close, and she lifted the metal piece fully into the light, holding it in both hands, and for a moment she simply looked at it, as if seeing more than what it showed, something tied to memory, to people who were no longer there, to a place that had been taken before she could understand what it meant, and her voice came soft, but clear. We cannot keep running, she said, and the boy's eyes closed briefly, just a second, before he opened them again, sharper now, more certain, and he nodded once, not because he agreed with the world outside, but because he understood her, and that was enough. And outside, Caleb heard the shift, not the words, but the decision behind them, the way the air inside the house changed when someone chose to stop being afraid, and he exhaled slowly, his shoulders settling just slightly, not in relief, but in acceptance, and without looking back, he stepped aside from the door, not opening it, not inviting anything in, just making space for something else to happen, and the handle turned from the inside. Slow, careful, and the door opened just enough for two small figures to step into the light. The morning sun catching their faces, their eyes steady despite everything, and Caleb remained where he was, no longer blocking, no longer leading, just present, as the space between the porch and the riders filled with something heavier than distance, something that had been building since the rain began, and the rider watched them closely, not with surprise, but with interest, as if the moment he had been waiting for had finally arrived, and the girl took one step forward, her hand still holding that small piece of metal against her chest, and the boy stood beside her, not ahead, not behind, and for the first time since they had arrived, they were not running, they were standing, and Caleb Whitaker, who had once believed that standing still was the same as being alone, realized in that moment that sometimes it was the only way to make sure no one else had to face something alone again. The distance between them did not close, but it no longer felt wide, not when the children stood on the porch in full view, their small figures framed by the open doorway, and the rider's gaze settled on them with a quiet intensity, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate, as if he had been picturing this moment long before it happened, and the others behind him remained still, their horses shifting only slightly under them, the leather creaking soft in the morning air, and the girl stepped forward another inch, just enough that the light caught the object in her hands again, and this time she did not hide it. She let it rest in her palm, open, visible, and Caleb watched the rider's eyes change, not with surprise, but with confirmation, like a man who had just seen the last piece fall into place. "That is what you came for," the girl said, her voice steady despite its softness, and the rider inclined his head once, acknowledging her without stepping closer. "It is," he replied, and the boy shifted beside her, his stance tightening, not to block her, but to stand with her, his gaze locked on the man beyond the fence. "It is not yours," the boy said, and the rider did not answer immediately, letting the words settle into the air between them, and when he did speak, his tone remained calm, measured. "It belongs to the land it represents," he said, "and the agreements tied to it." And the girl's fingers curled slightly around the metal piece, not hiding it, but holding it with purpose. "It belonged to our family before any agreement was written," she replied, and there was no anger in her voice, only certainty, the kind that does not need to be loud to be heard. And Caleb felt that shift again, deeper this time, the moment where this was no longer about pursuit or escape, but about something older, something rooted in truth, rather than force. And the rider studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze flicked briefly to Caleb, measuring him again, not as an obstacle, but as a factor in something larger. "You understand what you are holding," the rider said to the girl, not a question, but a test, and she nodded once, slow. "It is not just land," she answered. "It is proof." And the word hung there, heavier than anything else said so far, and Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly, not at the children, but at the man across from him, because proof changed things. Proof meant something could be settled without taking, without force, and the rider seemed to recognize that as well, his posture shifting. Just a fraction, less guarded now, more attentive. "Proof of what?" he asked, and the girl took a breath, steadying herself. "That what was taken was never given," she said, and the silence that followed stretched longer than any before it, the kind that forces every man in it to reconsider what he thinks he knows. And behind the rider, one of the others shifted in his saddle, not forward, not back, just enough to show that the weight of the moment had reached them too, and Caleb remained still, his presence unchanged, but inside, something moved, something he had not allowed himself to feel in years, the sense that this might not end the way he had expected, that this might not be about losing or winning at all. And the rider finally exhaled, slow, measured, his eyes never leaving the girl's. "Then perhaps," he said, his voice quieter now, carrying something new beneath it, "it is time we all listen to what that proof has to say." And Caleb Whitaker, standing between past and present, between land and those who claimed it, understood that the ground beneath them was no longer just dirt and fences. It was something that could change everything if someone was willing to hear it. The wind moved softer now, carrying the quiet weight of what had been said, and no one rushed to fill the silence that followed. Not Caleb, not the rider, not even the men behind him. Because something had shifted in the space between them, something that could not be undone with a raised voice or a quick decision. And the girl stood steady, her hand still open, the metal piece resting in her palm like it belonged there, not as a possession, but as a truth waiting to be recognized. And Caleb glanced at it again, longer this time, his mind reaching back through years he had tried not to revisit, through conversations overheard in distant towns, through deals spoken in low voices over maps spread across wooden tables, and slowly, quietly, the shape of it came together, not just what it was, but why it mattered. That mark, Caleb said, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful. It ties back to the old registry. Does it not? And the rider's eyes shifted toward him, not surprised, but attentive in a new way. You know of it, the rider replied, and Caleb gave a slight nod, his gaze never leaving the object in the girl's hand. Not everything written down stays buried, he said, and the girl looked at him then, really looked, as if seeing him not just as the man who opened the door, but as someone who understood more than he had let on, and the boy followed her gaze, his expression tightening with a question he did not ask, and the rider straightened slightly in the saddle, his posture no longer just patient, but engaged. Then you know, the rider said, that what we seek is not taken lightly. And Caleb exhaled slowly, his eyes lifting from the metal piece back to the rider. I know that what is written can be changed, he answered, but what is right rarely does. And the words settled deeper than before, not as resistance, but as a line drawn with care rather than force. And the rider studied him again, longer this time, as if measuring not just his stance, but his history, his place in all of this. And behind the rider, the others remained still, their presence steady, but no longer pressing, as if even they understood that this was no longer about pursuit. And the girl took a small step forward, closing the distance by just enough to make her voice carry clearly. My father kept records, she said, her tone calm, but carrying something stronger beneath it. He knew what they were doing. He knew what they would try to say later. And the boy's jaw tightened beside her, his eyes flicking briefly to Caleb, then back to the rider. And the girl continued. This is not just proof of land, she said, lifting the metal piece slightly. It is proof of what was changed after. And the air seemed to still around those words, not in tension, but in recognition, and Caleb felt it settle in his chest. The realization that this was not about ownership in the way most men understood it. This was about truth being carried through time by hands too small to have asked for it. And the rider's gaze lowered briefly to the object, then lifted again, and for the first time, there was something different there, not doubt, not denial, but consideration, the kind that comes when a man realizes the ground beneath him is not as certain as he believed. If that is so, the rider said slowly, then what you hold belongs in the hands of those who can read it fully. And the boy took a step forward now, not to challenge, but to stand beside the girl more firmly. And who decides that? He asked, his voice steady, and the rider met his gaze without hesitation. Those who understand what it means, he replied, and Caleb shifted then, just slightly, his presence, drawing attention without demanding it. Understanding is not the same as owning, Caleb said, and the rider looked at him again, and this time, he did not answer right away, because the truth in those words had nowhere easy to go, and the morning light spread wider across the land, touching the fence, the porch, the faces of everyone standing there, and in that quiet, open space, it became clear that this was no longer a matter of who arrived first or who held power, but who was willing to see what had been there all along, waiting to be acknowledged. The silence that followed did not feel empty anymore. It felt full, as if every word spoken had settled into the ground beneath them and refused to be ignored. And Caleb stood there with his hands resting loosely at his sides, not as a man guarding something, but as a man refusing to let it be taken without being understood. And the rider remained still in his saddle, his gaze shifting once more between Caleb and the children, not searching for weakness now, but for certainty, and it was there, in all three of them, quiet but unshaken, and that changed the weight of everything. Then maybe this is not about taking anything at all, the rider said slowly, his voice no longer carrying the same edge it had before, and one of the men behind him shifted again, not in impatience, but in uncertainty, as if the path they had ridden in on no longer led where they thought it would, and the boy noticed that, his eyes narrowing just slightly, reading the change in a way that only someone who had lived on the edge of danger could, and the girl held the metal piece closer to her chest, not hiding it, but protecting it. In a different way now, as if it had become more than proof, as if it had become a voice of its own, and Caleb took a slow breath, his gaze moving out across the land once more, the fences stretching long and straight, the fields still damp from the night before, everything looking the same as it always had, and yet nothing felt the same anymore, because for the first time in years, this place was no longer just his. It had become something shared, something tied to a truth that had walked in through his door without asking. "You said it belongs to those who understand it," Caleb said, his voice calm, but carrying further now, reaching not just the rider, but the others behind him. "Then understanding has to start here." And he gestured lightly toward the children, not as a defense, but as a statement, and the rider followed that motion with his eyes, his expression unreadable, but no longer closed. And the girl stepped forward again, just a little, enough that her voice did not need to rise. "We are not asking to keep anything that is not ours," she said. "We are asking for what was changed to be seen the way it was before." And the boy stood beside her, his shoulders squared now, not from fear, but from standing in something he believed in. And the rider listened, really listened, his posture no longer that of a man arriving, but of a man reconsidering. And the others behind him grew still in a different way, not waiting for orders, but waiting for an answer that none of them had expected to need. And the wind passed through the open land again, softer now, carrying the quiet sound of a world that had not stopped for any of this. And Caleb felt it, that shift, the moment where things could go one way or another without force deciding it. And he knew then that whatever happened next would not be written in contracts or claimed by distance. It would be chosen, right here, by the people standing in front of him. And the rider finally drew in a breath, slow and measured, his eyes settling once more on the girl, then on the boy, then back to Caleb. And when he spoke, his voice had changed, not weaker, but clearer. "Then we do not take it today," he said, and the words settled into the morning air like something that had not existed until that moment. And Caleb did not react outwardly, did not nod or step forward, but inside, something eased, something that had been held tight since the knock on the door. And the rider continued, "But this does not end here." And there was no threat in it, only truth, the kind that acknowledged that some things took longer than a single morning to resolve. And Caleb understood that, too. The way the land held stories that did not fade just because men chose to walk away. And he gave the smallest nod in return, not agreement, not victory, just recognition. And behind him, the children stood a little straighter, not because they were safe, but because they had been heard, and sometimes that was the beginning of everything. The riders did not turn their horses right away, and that was what made the moment linger, not as tension, but as something unfinished, like a sentence left open on purpose. And Caleb watched them carefully, the way a man watches weather that might return before nightfall. And the lead rider rested one hand lightly on the saddle horn, his gaze still steady, but no longer fixed on taking anything. Instead it carried something quieter, something that had shifted without needing to be named. "We will come back," he said, not as a warning, but as a fact. And Caleb gave a small nod, the kind that did not welcome it, but did not deny it either, because some things did not end with a single decision. They only changed direction. And the rider turned his horse slightly then, just enough to signal the others, and one by one, the men behind him followed, their movements calm, unhurried, as if the urgency that brought them here had dissolved into something else, something that required thought rather than action. And the sound of hooves began to drift away across the damp ground, softer with each step, until the open land swallowed it again, leaving only the quiet of morning behind. And Caleb remained where he stood, not moving, not calling after them, just watching until the last figure disappeared into the distance. And only then did he turn back toward the porch, where the children still stood, their small forms framed by the doorway, their expressions unchanged, but something in their posture had eased, not safety, not relief, but a recognition that the moment had passed without breaking them. And Caleb stepped closer, not too close, just enough to stand beside them rather than in front, and for a moment, none of them spoke, because there was nothing simple enough to say. And the girl lowered her hand slowly, the metal piece, resting once more against her chest. But it did not look the same now, not like something hidden, but something carried with purpose, and the boy glanced out across the land where the riders had gone, his eyes narrowing slightly, not in fear, but in thought. "They will come back," he said quietly, and Caleb nodded once. "Most things that matter do," he replied, his voice calm, and the boy looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to understand why a man who had everything would choose to stay in something that could take it away. And Caleb met that look without hesitation, not offering explanation, just presence. And the girl stepped forward a fraction, her gaze shifting between them, then out to the land. And for the first time, there was something in her eyes that had not been there before, not just resolve, but direction, and she spoke softly. "Then we need to be ready when they do." And Caleb let out a slow breath, his eyes moving across the fields, the fences, the horizon. That stretched farther than most men ever walked, and he understood what that meant. Not just waiting, not just defending, but deciding what kind of ground this place would be when they returned. And he turned back toward the house, pushing the door open wider, the warmth inside reaching out into the morning air, and he stepped aside, not leading, not ordering, just making space, and the children followed, not as guests this time, but as something else, something that belonged not to the land, but to the choice that had been made on it. And as the door closed behind them, the ranch stood quiet once more, but it was no longer the silence of a man alone. It was the kind that holds meaning, the kind that waits, not for trouble, but for what comes next. The house settled into a quiet that felt different from before, not empty, not forgotten, but lived in, and Caleb stood near the window as the light climbed higher across the land, watching the long stretch of fence that had once marked the edge of everything he knew, and now felt like the beginning of something he had never planned for. And behind him, the children moved slowly through the room, not like strangers anymore, not like guests either, but like people learning the shape of a place. They might stay, even if only for a while. And the girl paused near the table, her fingers brushing the worn wood. Then she lifted the small metal piece again, holding it carefully in the light. And for a moment she did not speak, as if listening to something no one else could hear. And the boy stood near the doorway, his eyes drifting between her and Caleb, no longer watching for danger, but searching for understanding. And Caleb turned from the window at last, his gaze resting on them both. Steady, calm, the way a man looks when he has already made his choice and does not need to explain it. "There is a town about 20 miles east," Caleb said, his voice low, measured, records office still standing. "People there who remember things the way they were." And the girl looked up at him, her expression quiet but certain, and the boy stepped closer, his shoulders no longer tight with the weight of running, but held in something steadier, something chosen. "You would take us there?" the boy asked, not as a question, but as a realization, and Caleb gave a small nod. "If that is where the truth needs to be seen," he replied, and the words did not sound like a favor, they sounded like a direction, and the girl lowered her gaze back to the metal piece in her hand, then slowly placed it against her chest again, not hiding it, not protecting it, but carrying it the way it was meant to be carried. And outside, the wind moved gently across the fields, no longer carrying the weight of the storm, just the quiet rhythm of a new day beginning. And Caleb reached for his hat, placing it on his head with the same steady motion he had done 1,000 times before, but this time it felt different, not like preparation for work, but like preparation for something that mattered. And he stepped toward the door, opening it wide to the morning light. And for a moment he paused there, looking out across the land that had once been enough for him. And he understood then that it had never been about how much a man owned. It had been about what he chose to stand for when something found its way to his door, and he stepped outside, not alone this time, because the children followed, their steps quiet but sure behind him, and the three of them stood there for a moment, side by side, facing a road that stretched farther than any of them had walked before. And Caleb did not say anything else, because there was nothing left to explain. And as they began to move forward together, the ranch behind them did not feel abandoned. It felt changed, like a place that had finally been used for what it was meant to be, not just land, Not just shelter, but a place where something right had been chosen when it mattered most. And out here, where the wind carried stories farther than voices ever could, that kind of choice did not fade. It stayed, quiet and steady, long after the dust had settled.